The attorney's eyes stayed on the screen. Another attorney walked over, whispered something, and the smile disappeared from both of their faces. Around Everett, conversations faded into uncomfortable silence. "I'm sorry," the lead attorney finally said. "She has refused to sign, and we can't execute this agreement." He enlarged the final certification page until one name filled the screen. Required independent mediation certification, Simone Carter. Everett didn't move. Everett frowned. The executive looked at him, confused. Everett's lips parted. Simone? He swallowed hard. "My wife." The room fell silent. No one said another word. Everett stared at the name as though it belonged to someone he'd never met. Now, the biggest day of his life had stopped because of one name he thought had nothing left to do with his future. Welcome to the Greer Stories. Thank you to everyone who has supported this channel and helped us grow. We truly appreciate every one of you. If you're new here, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and become part of our growing family. To understand why the woman Everett called his wife refused to sign the one document that stood between him and the biggest deal of his career, we have to go back several months, to a marriage that quietly broke long before either of them admitted it. By the time Everett turned into the grocery store parking lot, Simone was already standing beside the cart return, one hand wrapped around a canvas shopping bag and the other shielding her eyes from the late afternoon sun. She spotted his truck before he found her. "You were supposed to beat me." "I stopped for gas." "You always stop for gas." "Exactly." She smiled as he climbed out. "So you've had years to improve." He reached for her bag before she could protest. "It's heavy. It has 2 reusable bags inside." They looked heavy. She let him carry it anyway. Some habits had nothing to do with weight. Friday evenings belonged to them. No clients, no networking dinners, no church meetings, no work calls if they could help it. Just groceries, dinner, chocolate chip cookies, and whatever old movie they ended up pretending to watch before one of them fell asleep on the couch. Neither of them remembered exactly when the tradition had started. Neither of them wanted it to stop. Inside the store, they moved without discussing where they were going. Everett headed toward produce. Simone disappeared into the baking aisle. By the time he reached the tomatoes, she was already beside him again, dropping chocolate chips into the cart. "We haven't even bought dinner." "I like being prepared." "For dessert?" "For happiness." He looked into the cart. "You bought the expensive ones. They melt better." "You say that every week." "Because it's true every week." He laughed and reached for the cheaper brand. Without looking, Simone quietly switched them back. "You did that on purpose." "I absolutely did." "You know I noticed." "I know." He left the better chocolate chips where she had put them. Some arguments had ended years ago. An older man reaching for onions watched the exchange with a grin. "My wife used to do the same thing." Everett smiled. "Did you ever win?" The man laughed. "I stopped trying." Simone looked at Everett. "Smart man." The stranger walked away, shaking his head, still smiling. Everett leaned closer. "You recruit allies everywhere." "I don't recruit anyone. They volunteer." That wasn't entirely untrue. People had a way of talking to Simone. Cashiers, neighbors, parents, strangers waiting in line. She never rushed conversations, even when she had somewhere to be. She asked questions most people skipped. She listened without planning her next sentence. More often than not, people left feeling lighter than when they'd found her. Everett had seen it happen so many times, it barely surprised him anymore. As they rounded the next aisle, raised voices drifted in from the front entrance. A man in a business suit stood beside an SUV parked crooked across 2 spaces. A young mother held onto a stroller with one hand while pointing toward a dent on her rear bumper. "I told you I didn't hit your car." "You were the only one parked beside me." "I wasn't even here when you got back." People slowed for a second, then kept walking. Everett glanced toward the doors before continuing. Simone didn't. She stopped. "I'll be right back." He already knew where she was going. By the time he reached them, Simone wasn't talking about the dent. She was asking questions. "What time did you park?" The man answered. She looked at the young mother. And when did you come back? Another answer. She crouched slightly, studying the scrape on both vehicles without touching either one. Then she looked toward a security camera mounted above the entrance. Before either of you spends the rest of your evening blaming the wrong person. She pointed upward. Why don't we ask the store manager to check the footage? Neither of them spoke. It was such an obvious solution that both looked slightly embarrassed for missing it. The young mother sighed first. You're right. The businessman rubbed the back of his neck. I got ahead of myself. You've both had long days, Simone said gently. Let's make sure you're upset with the right person. 10 minutes later, the store manager confirmed another driver had clipped both vehicles while backing out before leaving without reporting it. The businessman apologized first. The young mother apologized immediately after. Neither looked angry anymore. As they walked back toward the checkout, Everett handed Simone a bottle of water from the cooler. You've done that hundreds of times. I've done what? Walk into someone else's argument like you were invited. I wasn't. No, he smiled. They're always relieved you showed up anyway. She unscrewed the bottle. I don't like watching people spend energy fighting the wrong battle. Everett looked at her for a second, before nodding. I know. He had watched her do the same thing at church committee meetings. Between neighbors. During family disagreements. Even at city forums, where people walked in expecting another shouting match and walked out shaking hands. Houston knew Simone Carter as someone who could help people find common ground without making anyone feel defeated. Everett simply knew her as the woman who still bought the expensive chocolate chips because she believed some things were worth doing properly. By the time they reached the checkout, his phone vibrated. The screen lit up with his manager's name. He answered. Hey, Richard. Simone busied herself unloading groceries. Everett listened. His expression didn't change. He simply listened. Then, Monday morning? A pause. Another, I'll be there. He ended the call without saying anything else. Simone looked over. Everything okay? Everett stared at the dark screen in his hand for another second before slipping the phone into his pocket. A smile slowly found its way across his face. I think. He looked at her. Something finally moved. Everett arrived at Hargrove Urban Development 20 minutes early. He wasn't the first one there. Assistants hurried through the lobby, carrying folders marked confidential. Executives who normally stopped to chat barely looked up as they passed. Something important was already moving through the building. At exactly 9 o'clock, Richard Lawson appeared outside Everett's office. They're ready. Everett stood. For what? You'll find out. Richard led him into the executive boardroom. 6 people sat around the polished table. No one smiled. The president of the company folded his hands. How long have you worked here, Everett? 9 years. How many promotions? Everett answered without hesitation. None. The room stayed quiet. Another executive leaned forward. Then why didn't you leave? Everett thought about it before answering. I've had offers. Why stay? He looked around the room. Because I believed one day the work would matter more than who got the credit. Nobody spoke. Richard looked down, hiding a smile. The president finally nodded. That's exactly why you're here. He slid a thick folder across the table. Everett opened it. Across the cover, in bold letters, were the words, Houston East River Redevelopment Initiative. His eyes lifted slowly. The East River Project? It's reached final negotiations, the president said. The company has decided you're the right person to lead operational coordination. Everett stared at the folder. For years he'd imagined hearing something like this. Now that it was happening, he couldn't think of a single word to say. Richard broke the silence. You've spent 9 years solving problems before anyone else knew they existed. This project won't be won by the loudest voice in the room. It'll be won by the person who keeps everything from falling apart. Everett finally nodded. I won't let you down. Before leaving, he signed a confidentiality agreement thicker than any contract he'd handled before. No client names, no negotiation details, no discussions outside the authorized team. He understood every word before he signed it. Across downtown Houston, Simone was ending a mediation between two nonprofit organizations arguing over shared funding. Neither side walked away completely happy. Both walked away willing to keep talking. As the last participants left the conference room, her firm's director stepped inside. "Got a minute?" She smiled. "For you, usually." He laughed. "I've got something I'd like you to handle." "Should I be nervous?" "You should be proud." He placed a sealed file on the table between them. The cover carried only one instruction: confidential. The city requested an independent mediator. Simone looked up. "For what?" "I can't answer that until you accept the assignment." She didn't hesitate. "Where do I sign?" He handed her the agreement. She read every page carefully. That was another habit Everett admired about her. She never signed anything she hadn't taken the time to understand. When she finished, she wrote her name, closed the folder, and handed it back. Only then did her director slide the confidential case file toward her. "You'll receive introductions over the next few weeks. Until then, no discussions outside the mediation team." She nodded once. "Understood." That evening, Everett came home carrying takeout instead of groceries. Simone looked up from the kitchen. "I thought we were cooking." "We're celebrating." She smiled before he even explained. "What happened?" He set the bags on the counter. "I finally got the opportunity I've been waiting for." She crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps and wrapped her arms around him. "I knew your day was coming." "I wasn't so sure." "I was." They ate dinner at the kitchen island, laughing more than talking. At one point, Everett glanced toward his briefcase. "I had to sign another confidentiality agreement today." Simone smiled. "So did I." He looked up. "Big assignment?" She shrugged gently. "Important enough." He grinned. "I guess we won't be telling each other much for a while." She reached across the counter and squeezed his hand. "We never have." It wasn't a complaint. It was trust. Before bed, Everett placed his project folder on the kitchen island while answering a message from Richard. A few minutes later, Simone walked in from the study carrying her own confidential file. Without looking, she set it beside Everett's. Different companies, different logos, 2 sealed folders, side by side. Neither of them noticed the matching project number printed in the lower right corner. Simone picked up a glass of water. Everett closed his briefcase. The folders remained there for another few seconds, before each quietly picked up the wrong one. Not to open it, simply to carry it back to opposite sides of the house. Neither realized their futures had already crossed paths. They only believed they had another ordinary evening together. The first month hardly felt different. Everett still made time for Friday grocery trips. They still argued over the expensive chocolate chips. They still ended most evenings on the couch with a movie neither of them ever finished. If anything had changed, it was too small to name. One Friday evening, they stood side by side in the kitchen measuring flour into a mixing bowl. Simone cracked the eggs. Everett reached for the vanilla. His phone buzzed across the counter. He glanced at the screen. "I'll ignore it," he said. He poured the vanilla into the bowl. The phone buzzed again, then a third time. He wiped his hands on a towel. "I'm sorry. This will only take a second." Simone nodded without looking up. "I know." He stepped into the hallway. She kept mixing. The butter, the sugar, the chocolate chips. By the time he returned, the dough was already resting in the baking tray. He looked at the bowl. "You finished. You said it would only take a second." A faint smile crossed his face. "I guess I did." He kissed her temple before sliding the tray into the oven. Neither of them thought much about it. The next Wednesday, Everett attended his 3rd executive dinner in 2 weeks. The conversations drifted from market forecasts to negotiations, then to leadership. One executive laughed as he stirred his coffee. "The quickest way to lose a project is trying to keep everyone happy." Another nodded. "You don't get paid to be liked." Someone farther down the table added, "Compromise has its place." He paused before smiling. "But not when you're holding the stronger position." Nobody argued. The conversation simply moved on. Everett didn't say much that evening. He mostly listened. When he got home, Simone was finishing a late cup of tea. You look tired. It was a long dinner. She poured him a cup without asking. Everything okay? He shrugged off his jacket. One of the executives said something interesting. What? He wrapped both hands around the mug. He said you can't build something important if you're worried about disappointing everyone. Simone leaned against the counter. What do you think? He thought for a moment. I don't know yet. She smiled gently. Then don't let someone else decide for you. He smiled back. I won't. He believed that when he said it. The following week, Simone arrived home carrying a notebook filled with handwritten pages. Everett was already sitting at the dining table, surrounded by architectural drawings. She hung her bag by the door. You would have loved today. He looked up. Good day? She smiled. I had 2 community groups that hadn't spoken to each other in almost a year. What happened? They finally agreed on a shared plan. He grinned. I knew you could do it. She pulled out the chair across from him. There was one moment. His phone lit up. Everett glanced down. I'm sorry. She looked at the screen. Go ahead. I'll be right back. He answered the call as he walked toward the living room. She waited. The excitement she'd carried home slowly settled into silence. After a minute, she opened her notebook again. She reread the notes she had planned to show him. Then she quietly closed it. By the time Everett returned nearly 20 minutes later, he looked relieved. Sorry about that. Everything okay? They approved tomorrow's presentation. That's wonderful. He smiled. What were you saying earlier? She looked at the closed notebook for a second before sliding it into her bag. Oh. She smiled politely. It wasn't important. He accepted the answer without realizing it wasn't true. A few nights later, dinner was ready by 7. 2 plates sat on the table. The food was still steaming when Everett's phone rang. He looked at the screen. I have to take this. She nodded. I figured. I'll only be a minute. He stepped outside onto the patio. Simone poured 2 glasses of iced tea. She sat down. She looked once toward the back door. Then she picked up her fork. The vegetables cooled first. Then the chicken. The ice in Everett's glass began to melt. She finished eating, carried both plates into the kitchen, wrapped his dinner, and placed it in the refrigerator. She had just closed the door when Everett came back inside. A smile spread across his face. They finally signed off on tomorrow's presentation. He loosened his tie and walked toward the dining table. Then he stopped. His chair was empty. His dinner was gone. Only the ring of condensation from the untouched glass remained on the table. He looked toward the kitchen. Simone was wiping the counter with slow, practiced movements. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't angry. It was unfamiliar, and for the first time since they had been married, they ended the evening in the same house, living 2 different days. Nobody decided to change their marriage. It simply stopped asking permission. The first Friday Everett missed their grocery trip, they laughed it off. The second time, Simone went alone. By the 3rd week, groceries started arriving in brown paper bags on the front porch every Thursday afternoon. One evening, Everett walked into the kitchen carrying his laptop. He stopped when he noticed the delivery bags. When did we start doing this? Simone was putting vegetables into the refrigerator. A few weeks ago. He looked genuinely surprised. I didn't even notice. She smiled without looking up. I know. It wasn't sarcastic. It was simply true. He set the laptop on the counter. We should go ourselves next week. I'd like that. Neither of them mentioned it again. The following Friday came and went. The groceries arrived at 2:15. No one drove to the store. A month later, Everett opened the pantry looking for something sweet. Didn't we have chocolate chip cookies? Simone glanced over from the dining table where she was reviewing mediation notes. We ran out. When? She thought for a second. I don't remember. He closed the pantry. We should make some this weekend. She smiled. We should. Saturday disappeared into conference calls. Sunday disappeared into preparation for Monday. The chocolate chips stayed on the shopping list. One Tuesday afternoon, Simone received a handwritten thank you card from 2 neighborhood leaders she had helped reconcile months earlier. She smiled as she read it. Then she folded it carefully and placed it beside Everett's coffee mug. She thought he'd enjoy reading it. That evening he came home talking before he'd even taken off his jacket. "You won't believe today." She looked up. "What happened?" "The investors finally approved the revised infrastructure proposal." His excitement filled the room. She smiled because she loved seeing him hopeful. Halfway through the story, his phone vibrated. He glanced down. "I need to answer this." She nodded. "Go ahead." By the time he finished the call, the thank you card had disappeared beneath 3 sets of blueprints spread across the kitchen island. The next morning he grabbed his coffee, his briefcase, and the blueprints. The card stayed where it was, unread. Simone found it later while wiping the counter. She looked at it for a moment before slipping it into the kitchen drawer. She never mentioned it. A few weeks later, her church friend Denise called. "We're starting a Tuesday dinner group." Simone laughed. "You know Tuesdays are impossible." "They don't have to be." She hesitated. "I'll think about it." The following Tuesday, she went. Not because she wanted to replace dinner with Everett, because she was tired of setting the table for 2, when most Tuesdays she ate alone anyway. When Everett arrived home that night, the house was dark except for the light above the stove. He checked the living room, then the study. Finally, he called upstairs. "Simone?" No answer. A note rested beside the fruit bowl. "Dinner's in the oven. I'll be home around 9. He read it twice, then smiled to himself. Good. He warmed his plate and ate at the kitchen island while answering emails. For the first time in months, he was the one eating alone. When Simone returned, he was still awake. "How was dinner?" She set her purse on the chair. "It was nice." "Who was there?" "A few people from church." He nodded. "I'm glad you went." She looked at him for a second. "So am I." Neither realized something important had happened that evening. They hadn't argued. They hadn't drifted further apart in a single dramatic moment. They had simply begun building lives that no longer depended on waiting for the other person to come home. A few days later, Everett stood in the hallway looking at the family calendar. Most of the squares were full. Meetings, mediation sessions, city hearings, investor dinners, community forums. Without thinking, he picked up a pen and wrote across the following Friday evening, "Dinner with Simone." He stepped back and smiled. "We've been terrible at making time." From the kitchen, Simone looked toward the calendar. She smiled back. "We have." Friday arrived. At 4:40 that afternoon, Everett's phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Richard, I'll call him back," Everett said to himself. The phone rang again, then a third time. He answered. Simone watched from the doorway as he listened without speaking. Finally, he nodded. "I'll be there." He ended the call slowly. They moved the executive meeting. She already knew the rest. "It's tonight." He nodded. "I'm sorry." She walked over to the calendar, uncapped a marker, and quietly drew a single line through the words, "Dinner with Simone." Then she placed the marker back exactly where she'd found it. "It's okay," she said softly. "We'll pick another day." Everett believed her. Simone wanted to believe herself. The calendar stayed on the wall for another week. Neither of them crossed out the empty Friday that followed. By the middle of autumn, Everett no longer measured his weeks by weekends. He measured them by deadlines. Every completed milestone uncovered another one waiting behind it. The project never seemed to ask for less, only more. One afternoon, Richard caught him outside the conference room. "You've got a minute?" Everett nodded. Richard handed him a cream-colored envelope, embossed with the company's logo. "The Redevelopment Gala." Everett smiled. "I almost forgot." "You won't after tonight." Richard looked at the invitation. "Bring your wife if you want." There was a brief pause before he added, "But most of the team comes alone." Everett looked up. "Why?" Richard shrugged. "These nights aren't really social. They're relationships." "Aren't those the same thing?" "They are in every other part of life." Richard folded the invitation and handed it back. "Not in this business." That thought stayed with Everett much longer than he expected. That evening, Simone helped him straighten his bow tie. She stepped back. I think that's the best you've ever looked. He smiled. I had a good teacher. She brushed an invisible speck of lint from his jacket. So, what? Are you sure you don't want company tonight? He hesitated. I do. She waited. I just don't think this is that kind of evening. She studied his face for a second. Okay. He kissed her forehead. I'll make it up to you. She smiled. You've been saying that a lot lately. The words weren't sharp. They were almost playful. Almost. At the hotel ballroom, conversations floated somewhere between celebration and negotiation. No one seemed to stop working simply because they were holding a glass instead of a laptop. Everett moved from one conversation to another, answering questions, shaking hands, introducing himself to people whose names he'd spent years reading at the bottom of industry articles. Near the end of the evening, the music changed. The lights dimmed slightly. One by one, people began walking toward the dance floor. Everett watched as several executives greeted their spouses. One senior partner reached for his wife's hand before she even stood. Another laughed as his granddaughter pulled him toward the music. For a moment, Everett simply watched. Richard stepped beside him. You made the right decision. Everett looked over. What do you mean? Coming alone. Richard nodded toward the crowd. You've spent the whole evening building relationships. He lowered his voice. Sometimes that's easier without feeling responsible for someone else's evening. Everett looked back toward the dance floor. An executive he admired was quietly dancing with his wife. Neither seemed interested in impressing anyone. They were simply enjoying the song. Everett found himself smiling. Before he could think about why, someone called his name from across the room. He turned. By the time the conversation ended several minutes later, the music had stopped. Across town, Simone had spent the evening at her Tuesday community dinner group. As people gathered their coats, an older woman smiled at her. Your husband must be proud of what you do. Simone laughed softly. I hope he is. The woman tilted her head. What does he do? He's working on a redevelopment project. Oh. The woman smiled. Sounds like you're both helping build the city. Simone thought about that for a second. I suppose we are. She smiled politely, then changed the subject. The following Monday, Everett joined a strategy breakfast with several investors. Halfway through the meeting, one of them raised his coffee cup. Here's what I've learned after 30 years. The room grew quiet. The people who build something extraordinary are usually the people willing to disappoint someone today. A few people nodded. Another investor added, Family catches up. The opportunity doesn't. Nobody argued. Nobody celebrated the comment either. It simply settled into the room. Everett looked down at his notebook. He didn't write the sentence. He didn't challenge it. He simply underlined the meeting agenda. Once, without realizing he hadn't heard anything else for several seconds. That evening, he arrived home later than expected. Simone was reading on the sofa. She looked up. Long day? He loosened his tie. You wouldn't believe some of the conversations I've had lately. She smiled. Try me. He sat beside her. One investor said something interesting. What was it? He leaned back. He said, the people who build something extraordinary are usually the people willing to disappoint someone today. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed her book and rested it on her lap. What do you think? Everett looked toward the dark television across the room. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he answered honestly, I don't know. She reached over and took his hand. You don't have to decide tonight. He nodded. I know. She squeezed his hand gently. Just don't let someone else answer it for you. He looked at her. I won't. He meant every word. But somewhere between boardrooms, investor dinners, and promises made to himself, the question had already begun changing. Wednesday arrived without announcing itself. For the first time in weeks, Everett made it home before dinner. Simone smiled when she heard the front door open. You're early. I know. He held up a small paper bag. I even remembered dessert. She laughed. Who are you? And what have you done with my husband? He smiled. For one evening, I thought I'd let him come home. She shook her head. smiling as she unpacked 2 slices of pecan pie from the neighborhood bakery. "I was starting to think they'd forgotten your name." They almost had. Dinner felt familiar. They talked about a church fundraiser, a contractor who kept changing deadlines, a teenager Simone had helped reconcile with his father during mediation. Everett actually laughed. "I wish you could have seen his face." "I wish I had." For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. Then the conversation ran out. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply there. Everett looked at his plate. He turned his fork once, then set it down. Simone noticed. She didn't ask what was wrong. She waited. Finally, Everett spoke. "There's something I've been trying to say for a while." She looked at him. "Okay." He took a slow breath. "I don't know how. You've never needed perfect words with me." He smiled sadly. "I know." Another silence settled between them. "I keep telling myself this project is temporary." She nodded. "I know. But every time, I think things are finally slowing down." He looked toward the study. "They ask for more." She listened without interrupting. "I've been thinking about us." She folded her hands together. "So have I." He looked at her. "I don't think I've been the husband you deserve." She answered almost immediately. "No." He looked surprised. "You've simply stopped being here." The words landed softly. They didn't need to be louder. Everett lowered his eyes. "I don't know how to fix it." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Simone asked the question that had been quietly waiting between them for weeks. "What are you asking me, Everett?" He swallowed. His first answer never came. He tried again. "I thought—" "Oh." He stopped. The sentence fell apart before it reached the table. He closed his eyes briefly, then started over. "Maybe." Another pause. "Maybe you should stay with your sister for a while." The room became impossibly still. Simone didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him. "When did you decide this?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Without me?" Everett couldn't answer, because she was right. This conversation had started inside his own mind weeks earlier. She was only hearing it now. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know." She smiled sadly. "That's what makes this so hard." He reached across the table. She looked at his hand, then gently placed hers over it for just a moment. "I kept thinking that when this project was over." She paused. "I'd have you back." Everett looked down. "I don't know who I'll be when it's over." Neither of them noticed the tears in their own eyes. They only noticed each other's silence. After a long while, Simone stood. "I'll pack a few things." Everett rose instinctively. "I'll help." She gave him the smallest shake of her head. "No." Upstairs, she filled one overnight bag, not a suitcase. Just enough clothes for a few days. Her notebook, a sweater, her toothbrush. She paused in the bedroom doorway before turning off the light. Everything else stayed exactly where it belonged. When she came downstairs, Everett was still standing beside the dining table. The pecan pie sat untouched between them. She rested one hand on the overnight bag, the other tightened around her car keys. Everett looked at her. "You can come back whenever you're ready." She held his gaze. "I never wanted to leave." He looked away first. She walked to the front door, opened it, then stopped. Without turning around, she said quietly, "Take care of yourself, Everett." "You, too." She stepped outside. The cool evening air met her before she reached the car. She placed the overnight bag in the trunk, opened the driver's door, then stopped. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, but she didn't start the engine. Inside the house, Everett stood behind the living room curtain, watching. Neither moved, neither waved. Neither knew whether this goodbye would last a weekend or forever. Finally, the engine started. The taillights disappeared at the end of the street. Everett remained standing long after they were gone. 3 days later, the attorney's eyes stayed on the screen. Nobody applauded. A few moments earlier, the ballroom had been filled with congratulations. Now the only sounds were chairs sliding backward and quiet conversations no one wanted Everett to overhear. He remained exactly where he was, The giant screen at the front of the room had gone dark. Simone's name was gone, but he could still see it. Richard walked toward him, stopped, then thought better of putting a hand on his shoulder. Everett. Everett didn't answer. Across the room, reporters packed away cameras they had expected to use for a celebration. One producer whispered something into a headset before pointing toward the exit. The interview area prepared for Everett minutes earlier was quietly dismantled. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. Near the front row, a company assistant gathered the folders that had been placed on reserved seats for the executive team. She reached Everett's chair. For a second, she hesitated. Then she picked up the leather portfolio embossed with his name and tucked it beneath her arm before moving on. Everett watched her leave with it. He had imagined taking that folder home, showing Simone, telling her they had finally reached the finish line. Instead, someone else carried it away without saying a word. The ballroom emptied around him, not because anyone blamed him, because nobody knew what to say. His phone slipped from his hand and struck the polished floor. The sound echoed louder than it should have. He stared at it, didn't move. Richard bent down, picked it up, and held it out. Here. Everett looked at the phone, as though he'd forgotten it belonged to him. Thanks. His voice barely sounded like his own. The screen lit up. 3 missed calls. 4 messages from the legal team. No messages from Simone. He pressed her name. The call rang. Then, voicemail. He tried again. The same result. One of the attorneys approached carefully. We've delayed the signing. Everett looked up. Has anyone reached her? The attorney shook his head. No. We've tried since early this morning. Everett swallowed. You've been calling her. He couldn't finish the sentence. The attorney frowned slightly. We assumed you already knew she was serving as the independent mediator. Everett looked away. No. It was the first time he had admitted it out loud. I didn't know. The attorney's expression changed. Not suspicion. Surprise. He nodded once before quietly walking away. Everett stood alone for another moment. Around him, conversations drifted toward elevators and parking garages. The celebration had dissolved into logistics. Richard stepped closer. What are you going to do? Everett looked toward the ballroom doors. I'm going to find my wife. He didn't wait for another question. By the time he reached the parking garage, Houston's afternoon heat hit him all at once. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, then sat there. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but he didn't shift into gear. His mind searched desperately for explanations. Maybe she'd never received the final agreement. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe. His thoughts stopped. 3 nights earlier, she had walked out of their house carrying one overnight bag. He gripped the steering wheel harder. No. He whispered to himself. He reached for his phone again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. He backed out of the parking space. Traffic downtown barely moved. Every red light felt longer than the last. Every delay seemed personal. As he turned onto Westheimer Road, he passed the small bakery where he'd bought pecan pie the night he asked Simone to leave. He saw the storefront for only a second. It stayed with him much longer. A few blocks later, the grocery store appeared on the corner. Friday evenings, chocolate chip cookies, arguments over the expensive chocolate chips. The memories arrived without permission. At another red light, his hand drifted toward the empty passenger seat. Almost automatically, as though he were about to tell Simone what had happened. His fingers stopped halfway. The seat beside him was empty. He slowly pulled his hand back onto the steering wheel. For the first time since the signing ceremony collapsed, the deal wasn't what frightened him anymore. The possibility that Simone had chosen silence because of what had happened between them, that frightened him. 20 minutes later, Everett turned into the parking lot of Simone's apartment building. He parked beneath a live oak tree and switched off the engine. The light in her apartment was on. He looked up at the window. She was home. For several long seconds, he couldn't make himself open the truck door. 3 days ago, he had asked her to leave. Now, he didn't know whether she would even let him inside. Everett knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Simone stood there in a gray sweater with her sleeves rolled to her elbows. You found me. He nodded. I've been calling. I know. She stepped aside. Come in. The apartment was quiet. A lamp glowed in the corner of the living room. An overnight bag rested beside the bedroom door, still only half unpacked. Everett noticed it. Neither of them mentioned it. She closed the door behind him. He turned before she could walk away. The signing stopped. I know. They said you refused to sign. I did. He took one step toward her. Please. His voice was lower now. Please, sign it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said only one thing. Sit down. He didn't argue. He sat. She walked into the kitchen without another word. He listened to the sound of a cabinet opening, water running, coffee being poured, ordinary sounds. They somehow made the silence heavier. She returned with 2 mugs, placed one in front of him, kept the other for herself. Neither of them drank. Everett looked at the untouched coffee, then at Simone. If this is because of what happened between us. She didn't interrupt. Don't let our marriage become the reason this project falls apart. Silence. He kept going. Hundreds of people have worked for this. Still, she said nothing. I know I hurt you. His hands tightened around the warm mug, but don't punish them because of me. The room became still again. When he finally stopped talking, Simone asked quietly, Are you finished? He looked down. Yes. She nodded once. Good. Another long silence passed. Then she asked, Did you ever wonder why I never talked about this project at home? He answered without thinking, No. The words stayed between them. Neither tried to soften it. Simone lowered her eyes briefly. I know. She stood and disappeared into the second bedroom. A few moments later, she returned carrying a thick binder. She placed it on the dining table. Thud. Then she brought a second one. Thud. Everett looked from one binder to the other. What are those? She sat down again. Open them. He frowned. Simone. Please. He opened the first binder. The cover page matched what he remembered. Project title. Reference number. Revision date. Everything looked familiar. He opened the second. The same title. The same number. The same date. He looked up. They're identical. She said nothing. He turned another page. Still identical. Meeting summaries. Maps. Construction phases. Community consultation notes. He glanced toward her. I don't understand. She simply nodded toward the pages. Keep reading. He did. Another page. Another. Then, his hand stopped. He leaned closer. A paragraph near the bottom of the page wasn't where he remembered it. He checked the second binder. The paragraph wasn't missing. It had been replaced. He frowned. Maybe he'd remembered it wrong. He turned another page. This time, a compensation clause read differently. Not dramatically. Only a few lines. Enough to change who qualified. His breathing slowed. He flipped back. Then forward again. Another section. Another small difference. A sentence removed. A condition added. Nothing obvious. Nothing anyone would notice during a presentation. Everything someone living with the agreement would eventually feel. He kept turning pages. Faster. Then slower. The room remained silent except for paper sliding beneath his fingers. Finally, he closed one binder, opened it again, compared the pages once more. His shoulders sagged. No. The word barely reached the table. He looked at Simone. I would have never agreed to this. I know, she answered without hesitation. That's how I knew you hadn't read the version they asked me to certify. Everett stared at her. You don't think I knew? No. She met his eyes. I never believed you did. The air left his lungs. For the first time since the signing ceremony, someone still believed the man he used to be. He looked back at the binders. His voice was almost a whisper. Who changed it? Simone rested one hand on the closed binder. She didn't rush her answer. That's the first question you should have asked. The room fell silent again. This time, the silence wasn't standing between them. It was pointing them both toward the same truth. Everett remained seated. The two binders stayed open between them. He looked from one page to the other again. The words refused to become the same. There has to be another explanation. Simone wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I hope there is. Nothing in her voice sounded triumphant. If anything, she sounded tired. Everett stood and walked toward the apartment window. Below, evening traffic moved steadily through the streets. People crossed intersections. A city bus pulled away from the curb. Everything outside continued as though nothing had happened. Behind him, the apartment stayed quiet. They wouldn't do this. He wasn't looking at Simone. They spent months negotiating. She didn't answer. They wouldn't risk everything over a few changes. Still, she let him finish. Only then did she speak. My responsibility wasn't to decide who changed it. He turned toward her. It was to decide whether I could put my name on it. The room fell silent again. She rested one hand lightly on the nearest binder. When people agreed to those negotiations, they trusted that, if I certified the agreement, it matched what they accepted. She paused. If my signature says something is true when it isn't, what? She looked down for a moment. I lose my word. Nothing else needed saying. Everett lowered his eyes to the binders. For the first time all afternoon, he stopped trying to defend the project. Instead, he started remembering it. Late-night revisions, unexpected document updates, emails marked final, followed by another email marked final revised, meetings where someone always said, "We'll circulate the latest version tonight." He had accepted every change because he trusted the people sending them. He had never compared one version against another. He had never imagined he needed to. After several long moments, he looked at Simone. "You don't think I knew?" It wasn't a question. She answered anyway. No. No hesitation, no doubt. I never believed you did. The word settled somewhere deeper than guilt. For days, Everett had believed Simone left because she had stopped believing in him. Now he realized she had believed in him, even when he hadn't earned it. He looked away. Neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like grief. Eventually, Everett walked back to the table. He closed the first binder carefully, then the second. His hands rested on both covers. One contained the agreement he believed he had been helping build. The other contained the agreement presented for certification. He picked up the first binder, started toward the door, then stopped. He looked down at it. Slowly, he turned around, walked back to the table, and picked up the second binder too, one under each arm. Only then did he head for the door. His hand reached the doorknob. He almost said something. The words never came. Simone didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask him to fight. She didn't ask him to investigate. She simply watched him leave. Outside, the evening air felt heavier than before. Everett placed both binders on the passenger seat of his truck. For several seconds, he sat without starting the engine. He opened the blue binder again. Then the green. One more comparison. One more missing paragraph. One more altered clause. He reached for his laptop bag in the back seat. Logged into the company's secure document system, the revision history filled the screen. Version after version appeared in chronological order. He scrolled slowly. Revision 12. Revision 13. Revision 14. Everything looked routine. Then, his hand stopped moving. Between two approved revisions sat another file. Same project number, same date, no author listed, no approval record, no change log, just revision, 14 billions. Everett stared at the screen. The binders lay open beside him. For the first time since the signing ceremony collapsed, he wasn't asking whether Simone had been right. He was asking who wanted the truth buried badly enough to erase their own name from the record. Everett arrived before anyone else. The office lights were still off across most of the floor. Only the cleaning crew moved quietly between empty desks. He unlocked his office, closed the door behind him, and placed the two binders side by side. Blue, green. For a long moment, he didn't open either one. He simply looked at them. One represented everything he believed he had spent the past year building. The other represented the agreement Simone had refused to certify. He opened the blue binder first, then the green. Page by page, line by line. He stopped rushing, the way he should have months ago. Every few pages he found another change. Sometimes only a sentence. Sometimes a paragraph moved to another section. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would catch the attention of someone reading for a presentation. Everything that would matter to the people expected to live with it. He leaned back in his chair. Without meaning to, he heard Simone's voice again. If my signature says something is true when it isn't, I lose my word. He looked down at the pages. For the first time, he understood she hadn't been protecting herself. She had been protecting everyone who trusted her. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Richard stood in the doorway. You beat everybody in. I couldn't sleep. Richard noticed the binders. You've still got those. Everett nodded. I've been comparing them. Richard forced a small smile. You're probably working harder than you need to. Everett looked up. You think so? I think yesterday was difficult for everyone. Richard rested one hand on the doorframe. The best thing we can do now is let legal sort it out. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, Did you ever compare the final agreement with the negotiated version? Richard answered too quickly. I trusted the process. The words stayed with Everett after Richard left, not because they sounded dishonest, because they sounded exactly like something Everett himself would have said a week earlier. Late that morning, Everett walked downstairs to the legal department. Melissa Grant looked up as he entered. She didn't seem surprised to see him. I had a feeling you'd come back. He placed one binder on her desk. Not both, just one. I only need you to answer one question. She waited when Simone refused to certify this agreement. He paused. Were you surprised? Melissa didn't answer immediately. She looked at the binder instead, then back at Everett. No. He frowned. You expected it? I expected her to read every page. The room fell quiet. Everett looked at the binder. So, he spoke slowly. If you expected her to refuse. Melissa interrupted him gently. I didn't say that. Another pause. I said I expected her to read. She pushed the binder back toward him. You know Simone. She doesn't skim. Everett stood there for another few seconds, then nodded once. I guess I forgot that. Melissa's expression softened. No, she chose her words carefully. I think you forgot a lot of things. She didn't say them to wound him. She said them because they were true. Everett picked up the binder and left without another question. By late afternoon, the office had returned to its usual rhythm. Phones rang. Meetings started. People hurried past glass conference rooms carrying coffee and laptops. From the outside, everything looked normal. Everett returned to his office and opened both binders again. This time, he didn't search for differences. He searched for patterns. Every change seemed to move in the same direction. Promises became less specific. Protections became less certain. Commitments became easier to reinterpret later. He closed the binders slowly. Months earlier, he would have called those revisions efficient. Now, they looked like promises slowly losing their meaning. He stood and walked to the window, overlooking downtown Houston. The city stretched toward the horizon. Churches, neighborhoods, small businesses, families. He realized something that stopped him cold. For nearly a year, he had measured success by whether the deal could be signed. Simone had measured success by whether people could still trust the signatures on the final page. For the first time since the project began, he understood they had never been working toward different futures. They had simply been protecting different things. And for the first time in months, Everett no longer wanted to know how quickly the project could move forward. He wanted to know when it had started moving away from the people it was supposed to serve. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Everett knew it wouldn't stay that way. Richard looked up as Everett stepped into his office carrying both binders. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't. Richard noticed the binders. Again, you still carrying those around? Everett placed them carefully on the conference table between them. I compared every page. Richard leaned back in his chair. And? They aren't the same agreement. A long silence followed. Richard didn't reach for the binders. He didn't ask to see them. Instead, he folded his hands together. "What do you want from me, Everett?" "The truth." Richard gave a tired smile. "That's a dangerous word in business." Everett held his gaze. "I thought business depended on it." "It depends on results." The answer came so naturally that it almost sounded rehearsed. Everett looked down at the binders. Families accepted one version. So did the city. So did the churches. Richard nodded. "I know, but the certified agreement wasn't the same." Richard stood and walked toward the window. For several moments, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, he didn't turn around. "Do you know how many redevelopment projects collapse before they ever break ground?" Everett didn't answer. "Most, because everyone wants something." He looked out across the skyline. "If every promise stays exactly the way it started, and nothing gets built." Everett listened. Richard turned back toward him. "Language changes. Timelines change. Compromises change. That's reality." Everett looked at the binders again. "So people simply accept it?" Richard shrugged. "Most never notice." The words settled heavily between them. Everett looked up slowly. "They would have." Richard didn't answer. Simone noticed. Another silence. Richard walked back to the table. "This project will improve thousands of lives. I believe that. It will create jobs. I believe that too. It will bring investment into neighborhoods that have waited years." Everett nodded. "I believe all of that." Richard looked relieved. "Then don't let a few revised paragraphs destroy something bigger." Everett remained still. For the first time in months, he heard the sentence the way Simone would have. A few revised paragraphs. He remembered the elderly homeowners, the church parking agreement, the small businesses, not because of the individual clauses, because each clause represented a promise made to someone sitting across a negotiating table. He looked back at Richard. When did promises become negotiable? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled sadly. "When you start building projects this large." He paused. "You learn that perfection is expensive." Everett nodded slowly. "I used to think that too." Richard studied him. "What changed?" Everett rested one hand on the blue binder. The person who actually read every page. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Richard sighed. "This is how deals are done. No pride, no shame, just certainty." Everett realized that was what frightened him most. Richard genuinely believed he had done nothing unusual, nothing worth questioning, nothing worth losing sleep over. Everett closed both binders. The sound echoed softly through the office. "I can't pretend I didn't see this." Richard looked disappointed. "You'll lose this project." "I know. You'll lose your promotion." "I know. You may lose your future here." Everett nodded once. "I know." He picked up the binders, walked toward the door. His hand rested on the handle. Richard spoke one last time. "Don't throw away everything you've worked for." Everett looked back. His voice remained calm. "I already threw away something far more valuable." He opened the door and left. The emergency executive meeting began an hour later. No reporters, no investors, only company leadership. The atmosphere felt heavier than the canceled signing ceremony. Everett entered, carrying both binders. He didn't sit. He placed them side by side in the center of the conference table. No speech, no raised voice, no dramatic accusation. He opened both to the same page, then quietly slid them toward the people who had spent months discussing the project. "You should read these." Nobody moved at first. Finally, someone reached for the blue binder. Another reached for the green. The room grew silent, not because Everett had made an argument, because the documents had begun making one themselves. No one spoke for several seconds. The conference room remained still as the executives compared the two binders. One page, then another. The silence grew heavier with every turn. Finally, the company's general counsel closed the green binder. "We'll suspend the project immediately." No one argued. No one celebrated. The meeting ended without the contract. without the promotion, without the future Everett had spent years imagining. By the end of the week, the announcement was brief. The redevelopment project had been placed under independent review. Leadership changes would follow. Everett wasn't accused of altering the agreement. Neither was he congratulated for exposing it. He simply became part of the story no one wanted to discuss. A senior executive met him in a quiet office overlooking downtown Houston. "We appreciate everything you've contributed." Everett nodded. He already knew what came next. "Your position is being eliminated as part of the restructuring." The words were professional, carefully practiced. He listened without interrupting. When the meeting ended, he packed one cardboard box, a framed photograph, a coffee mug, a notebook filled with ideas for projects that would never happen. As he carried the box through the lobby, several coworkers looked up. Some offered small smiles. Others looked away. No one knew what to say. Everett understood. A few months earlier, he probably wouldn't have known what to say either. 4 months later, Everett's office overlooked a very different view, not the Houston skyline, a modest construction site on the edge of a growing neighborhood. There were no television cameras, no executive dining rooms, no investors waiting for presentations, only architects, contractors, community leaders, people who knew one another by first name. The company was smaller. The projects moved more slowly. Every contract meeting began the same way. One document, one version. Everyone at the table reading the same pages. The first time, Everett asked, "Does anyone have questions before we continue?" The room laughed gently. One contractor smiled. "You're the only project director I've ever met who asks that twice." Everett smiled back. "I've learned that the second time matters more than the first." Nobody understood the full meaning behind the sentence. He didn't explain it. He no longer felt the need to. Friday evenings slowly returned, not exactly as they had been, but close enough to remind him what ordinary life felt like. Sometimes he stopped at the neighborhood grocery store on the way home. Without thinking, he reached for a bag of chocolate chips. The first time he did it, he stood in the baking aisle for several seconds before realizing why. He smiled to himself, then placed them gently into his basket. Some habits outlived heartbreak. The house remained exactly as Simone had left it. Her favorite mug still rested on the second shelf. The cookbook they used every December remained beside the stove. Even the small calendar hanging near the refrigerator still displayed the months she had walked away. Everett had never found the courage to replace it. Not because he couldn't, because he hadn't been ready to admit how much time had passed. One Saturday afternoon, he carried another box toward the front door. The realtor would arrive on Monday. Keeping the house no longer made sense. It had become a place filled with memories instead of conversations. Before locking the door, he walked through each room one last time. The dining table, the study, the kitchen, the hallway where Simone used to leave her shoes after work. Every space felt familiar. Every space felt quieter than he remembered. He paused in the kitchen. His eyes settled on the empty corner where they used to cool chocolate chip cookies on Friday nights. He smiled, not because the memory stopped hurting, because it reminded him that success had once been measured in much smaller things. He switched off the kitchen light, closed the front door, locked it gently. As he walked toward his truck, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in months, Melissa Grant. He answered, "Hello?" Her voice was calm. "Everett." "Oh." She paused. "I think there's something about Simone you should know." Everett stopped walking. "What is it?" Another brief silence. "You never asked what happened after she refused to sign." The line went quiet, and for the first time in months, Everett realized there was still one sacrifice he knew nothing about. The house echoed differently once the furniture was gone. Everett carried one final box down from the hallway closet and set it beside the front door. Only the spare bedroom remained. It had slowly become the place where things without a permanent home were placed. Holiday decorations, old tax files, a sewing kit Simone had inherited from her grandmother. He opened the closet. Most of the shelves were empty, except for one gray storage box pushed carefully toward the back. He frowned. He didn't remember seeing it before. Dust covered the lid. He carried it into the bedroom and sat on the floor. Inside were neatly organized folders. The first one read, Washington, D.C. Everett opened it. Apartment brochures, neighborhood maps, public transportation routes. Another folder contained a formal job offer. Senior Director of Community Mediation. Washington, D.C. The salary was higher than his, much higher. He stared at the date. It had arrived nearly 2 months before the signing ceremony. Another folder. Monthly budgets. Moving expenses. Housing estimates. A handwritten checklist. Find church nearby. Compare health insurance. Moving truck estimates. He smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like Simone. Everything organized. Everything thoughtful. Then he noticed something strange. Every budget included 2 people, not one. Another page. Everett's commute. Everett's office options. Coffee shop within walking distance. His chest tightened. She hadn't planned a new life without him. She had planned a new life for both of them. At the bottom of the box rested a folded sheet of yellow legal paper. No envelope, no address, no stamp, only Simone's handwriting. He unfolded it carefully. I think I'm finally ready to tell Everett. Washington called again today. I accepted the offer, not because I want to leave him, because I think we can finally stop asking whose dream comes first. If his promotion happens, we'll both have the opportunity we've been waiting for. We'll figure out the rest together. That's what we've always done. The page ended there. No signature, no goodbye. It wasn't a letter. It was a thought she had written down for herself. Everett lowered the paper. She had never been asking him to choose between his future and hers. She had already found a way for both of them to have one. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he understood that Simone had solved a problem he never knew existed, and he had ended the marriage before she ever had the chance to tell him. The box remained open in the bedroom. Everett walked slowly into the kitchen. The room felt smaller without Simone's laughter filling it. He opened one cabinet. Empty. Another. Empty. Finally, he reached into the pantry. One package sat alone on the top shelf. Chocolate chips, the same brand they had bought nearly every Friday. He took the bag down. Tucked behind it was a grocery receipt. The date caught his attention. 3 days before Simone left. He read the list. Milk, butter, flour, vanilla, chocolate chips. He stared at the paper. 3 days before she packed one overnight bag. She had still been buying ingredients for Friday night cookies. She had still expected there to be another Friday. Another ordinary evening. Another chance to stand beside him in the kitchen while arguing about whether the cookies needed more chocolate. Everett slid down until he was sitting on the kitchen floor. The unopened bag rested in his hands. The receipt slipped quietly onto the tile. No tears came at first, only silence. The kind that finally says what words never could. For months he had believed Simone was standing between him and success. Now he understood. She had been standing beside him the entire time, protecting a future she believed they would share. The cookies had never been about dessert. They had been about coming home. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped coming home long before Simone stopped waiting. 3 years later, a young project manager waited until the training session had ended. Mr. Carter? Everett looked up from his notes. Yes? Can I ask you something? He smiled. Of course. What was the biggest mistake you ever made in your career? Everett didn't answer immediately. He looked through the conference room window at the people leaving for the evening. Then he smiled to himself, not because the memory no longer hurt, because he finally understood it. I spent years thinking success meant being chosen by important people. The young man nodded. Everett continued quietly. It took losing the person who chose me first. He paused. To understand, I had been measuring success the wrong way. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The young man finally asked, So, what do you teach now? Everett closed his notebook. I teach people to read every page. The young man laughed softly. You mean contracts? Everett smiled. Contracts. He stood. Promises. He picked up his coat. and the people quietly carrying your future while you're busy chasing it. That evening, on his way home, Everett stopped at a neighborhood grocery store. He walked the aisles without thinking. When he reached the baking section, his hand reached automatically for a bag of chocolate chips. He stood there for a moment. Then, almost without realizing it, he picked up a second bag. A small smile crossed his face. Some habits never disappear. Some acts of love never stop teaching us. And sometimes, the greatest success of a life isn't the deal that finally gets signed. It's recognizing, before it's too late, the quiet person who believed in your future long before the rest of the world ever did. Before we end, I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Everett deserved a second chance after everything he finally understood? Or do you believe some lessons arrived too late to change the ending? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can because the conversations we have here are just as meaningful as the stories themselves. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Greer Stories. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you stories that remind us love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in the ordinary moments we don't realize we'll miss until they're gone. And if there's someone in your life who's been quietly standing beside you through every season, maybe today is a good day to let them know you see them. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.